Yes, Stalin. Khrushchev. Russia. Okay. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there. I was just reading the biggest book I own on Russian history. And that's what this week's video is about. This week, this month. I'm not making promises when I'm releasing videos. That's just insanity. This video is about Russian history and its relation to U.S. history. So we're going to be focusing on how Obama specifically interacted with the government of Russia. The original script was like 17,000 words. I kind of took a deep dive into this. Whoops. So it's not all going to be in one video, so you're welcome. You can better spend the 3 hours watching RRR. Rise or Revolt. Hell yeah, great movie. Go see it. So first video in this series is going to be specifically about the breakup of the Soviet Union, the expansion of NATO into the former Warsaw Pact countries, and how Russia kind of saw those developments and reacted to those developments. It's also going to include some stuff about George W. Bush and his foreign policy and how he wanted to develop missile defense technology to put in Eastern Europe and how Russia reacted to that as well. Second part in the series is going to focus on the early Obama team efforts towards bilateral cooperation with Russia. The third section is going to follow how the U.S. and Russia tried to deal with the crisis and civil war in Syria. The fourth part is going to deal with the 2014 Maidan protests in Ukraine, how the U.S. reacted to those, what Russia did in response. The fifth part is going to be on the 2016 election and Russian attempts to interfere, meddle, sway the outcome of that election. So the main goal of the video is to contextualize events in 2022, give a little bit more nuance perhaps, or at least some fleshed out historical narrative, more than just Putin is crazy, or that NATO is some kind of fascist organization. So there's not going to be a lot of talk in here about how Ukraine is run by Nazis, or how Putin is bent on world conquest, or how NATO inherently spreads democracy. That's all kind of hyperbolic. This is more about what the U.S. has been doing in Eastern Europe, what Russia has been doing in Eastern Europe, and how those two powers play off each other. So hopefully you find it useful, informative, whatever. If you do, like, share, subscribe. If you don't like the video, please don't leave a comment. I don't care what you think. So without further ado, let's get started.
Now, Mr. Spock.
Relations between the U.S. and Russian Federation, or RF, between 2009 and 2016 were not guided or dominated by any one episode. A lot happened between the two largest nuclear powers. But human memory is selective, meaning that out of that maelstrom of activity, a few highlights remain in the public consciousness, leaving the rest to the archivists and antiquarians. So what is it that people tend to remember about those 8 years' worth of interactions between Obama's government and the Russians? Well, if they remember anything, it's probably some vague notion of a reset with Russia. Specifics might focus on the March 2009 Red Button incident, where U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton presented to the Russian foreign minister a red button emblazoned with the English word reset, and what she thought was the Russian translation. Now, the Russian word on the button actually meant overload, and to make the embarrassment complete, the type of button presented was that commonly used as an emergency stop on Russian industrial equipment. The memory of that episode came to encapsulate many interpretations of the Russia reset, something that was at best incomplete and at worst fiasco. But memory is not a record of events. It's a narrative of empirical impressions and emotional reactions. Does this narrative of diplomatic flub auguring a foreign policy failure hold true?
Yeah, pretty much.
If so, what might have caused the reset to fall short? And how does a better understanding of that diplomatic project help us to understand the current predicament with the Russia of 2022? To find out, we'll need some context. For current events without proper context is the realm of the propagandist, not the historian. Section 1. NATO expansion. What is NATO? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization developed after World War II and was the culmination of two primary factors. In the UK, planners realized that the sea was no longer the military barrier it once had been. With the advent of strategic bombers and the future possibility of atomic attack, they felt threatened in a way that they had not during World War I or the Napoleonic Wars. The solution that they came to was a more secure European continent, and that meant closer military alliances with continental powers and the United States. In the U.S., the Truman administration grew increasingly convinced that the Soviet Union was bent on world conquest and would make use of any and all methods in order to achieve this end. Reacting to this fear, Truman enunciated his doctrine of containment, that communism must spread no further. This meant increased U.S. intervention around the globe, including closer military cooperation with U.S. allies in Europe, most especially Britain, France, and West Germany. So, for various reasons, Western Europeans began discussing the prospect of a new military alliance. The result, after a year of debate among the various national participants, was the Washington Treaty, which created NATO in April 1949. On May 5, 1955, in the face of a U.S.-backed rearmament of West Germany and its official incorporation into the NATO alliance, which, incidentally, destroyed any chance of West and East Germany reunifying in the near term, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Treaty Organization, the Warsaw Pact, as a counterbalance to NATO. For the next 30-odd years, the two sides stood ready to do battle. NATO in transition. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, as the USSR shifted from reform to collapse, it became increasingly clear that the European security situation was changing. Looking towards this uncertain future, different European leaders made various, sometimes contradictory, public statements. In 1989, French President François Mitterrand floated the idea of a new European Confederation that included the USSR but excluded the United States. The next year, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker, while discussing the prospect of German reunification, assured the Soviets that NATO would not expand, quote, 1 inch to the east, and agreed with Gorbachev that NATO expansion would be quote-unquote unacceptable. That same year, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher assured the Soviets that their security concerns would be honored. In 1991, her successor went further and assured the Soviets that when it came to NATO expansion, quote, nothing of the sort will happen. NATO's Secretary General echoed these sentiments and assured the Soviets that the USSR would not be isolated from any future European community. He informed them that a majority of the NATO Council was against expanding the alliance. Even after Clinton took over as U.S. president, U.S. officials continued to assure the Russians that they would not be excluded from the European order. So what we have so far is a murky picture of European security, one that doesn't seem to include the eastern expansion of NATO, but regardless of the details, definitely has a place for the USSR/Russia. This ambiguity bled into the private statements and reports issued by the U.S. government at the time. The administration of Bush I did not publicly advocate the expansion of NATO. Even privately, the president advocated for the expansion of NATO only in the case of Germany. He wanted Germany reunified and NATO expanded to include both parts of the once divided country. But not all his defense team shared this caution. Indeed, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney began to get bolder ideas about the future of Eastern Europe. In 1990, the Department of Defense, under direct influence from Cheney himself, produced a report which advocated for a new strategy, one aimed at marginalizing the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, vis-a-vis NATO, expanding NATO beyond its current borders, and dismembering the USSR. With this context in mind, did the West, as is claimed by NATO's critics, actually promise not to expand NATO? Or did the Soviets and their Russian successors put too much stock in these informal mollifications? Well, it's true that no Western representatives made any official, concrete, or binding resolutions regarding the future of NATO, and what they said was certainly not consistent. Importantly, Western statements were interpreted by their erstwhile enemies as far less expansionist than at least some Western leaders had in mind. At this early juncture, U.S. leaders in particular did not choose to correct that misapprehension. So, when official U.S. policy did begin pushing for NATO enlargement, betrayal boiled in the minds of Russia's leaders. It didn't take long for Clinton to dispel the ambiguity and set U.S. policy squarely in the direction of NATO enlargement. He articulated this decisive shift in January 1994 via the formulation of not whether, but when and how. Clinton did not pull this policy position out of thin air. Indeed, he merely echoed the emerging consensus among liberal U.S. policymakers in favor of an unambiguous expansion of NATO into the post-Soviet states. His national security advisor, Anthony Lake, was the first active politician to come forth with a doctrinal rationalization of the NATO expansion, and he based this policy on 2 points. 1. Enlarging NATO meant enlarging the zone of political stability, which in turn would benefit the U.S. economically, expanding export markets and thus creating U.S. jobs. This would also, it was assumed, improve living conditions in the post-Soviet countries, and therefore fuel demands for political liberalization in other places, who saw the improvements made in the Soviet sphere. 2. Based on the assumption that liberal democracies don't fight one another, this spread of market democracies into the former Warsaw countries would augment U.S. security. This line of reasoning was a shift away from the doctrine of containment of communism towards the doctrine of enlargement of liberalism personified in NATO. Lake's arguments were echoed and enlarged by other intellectuals and politicians, both in the U.S. and in European countries like Germany or the Czech Republic. Although expansion proponents in the post-Soviet countries remained wary of Russia and Germany, and thus saw alliance membership as a guarantee of independence from their larger neighbors, the theme of stability remained paramount. Moreover, Western planners themselves made no mention of containing Russia. Few, if any, at the time saw the new Russian Federation as a legitimate military threat. So for U.S. liberals, NATO expansion was active destiny, not reactive countermeasure. The first and most important test of this new vision for post-Cold War NATO came in the wake of Yugoslavia's disintegration into internecine violence. Now, the breakup of Yugoslavia was a decades-long process, which began during the Cold War. The death of its longtime president in 1980 prompted political reform and a council-style leadership made up of the principal members of the Federation, 8 in total. This new leadership faced an increasingly worse economic situation throughout the decade that they attempted to ameliorate with foreign loans. The end of the Cold War brought an end to both U.S. and Soviet funding, which prompted the Yugos to seek financial assistance from the International Monetary Fund. This Western-dominated body agreed to lend the Socialist Federation money, but only if it engaged in wholesale economic reform. The Council, deadlocked as to how they should proceed, was further hampered by Serbian efforts to consolidate power by dominating some of the other smaller members of the Federation. This prompted the Croats, Slovenes, and Macedonians to secede from the Union in the early 1990s. The Serbians, who still led the rump Yugoslavia, sent troops into various regions in order to restore the political status quo, and the bloodshed that resulted was immense. Although violence was widespread, two areas saw the most fighting. Bosnia came first, as ethnic Serbs clashed with other groups in the area. Serbia came to the aid of their ethnic kin, intensifying the conflict. NATO planes and troops intervened in 1994, and Serbia bowed to this pressure, acquiescing to a diplomatic solution. A few years later, violence erupted in the autonomous region of Kosovo, where Serbian forces again attempted to impose their will. In 1999, NATO, pushed along by the Clinton administration, once again intervened against Serbia. Both of these NATO interventions were draped in the language of humanitarian assistance and anti-authoritarianism. Now, certainly individuals involved may have seen their actions in this light, but nations and alliances do not act out of kindness. They act out of interest and necessity. In this case, economic and political interests prompted intervention, as, to quote a former Clinton official, Yugoslavia's resistance to the broader trends of political and economic reform, not the plight of Kosovar Albanians, best explains NATO's war. Moreover, this was a key moment for the future of the alliance. For failure to intervene decisively in the Balkans, the first time NATO had ever used military force, would have called into question the rationale for its subsequent expansion. As Secretary of State Madeleine Albright wrote,
"And we would look like fools proclaiming the alliance's readiness for the 21st century when we were unable to cope with the conflict that began in the 14th.
For Clinton and other proponents of NATO expansion, intervention was thus not just in their economic interest, but was a political necessity, an affirmation of NATO's efficacy in the New World. And sitting on the sidelines of this intervention was a crisis-ridden Russian Federation, whose leaders and elites had to endure the spectacle of foreigners meddling in the affairs of a country Russia had long considered under its protection and influence. Enlargement. With a policy established and a rationale taking form, the only thing left standing in the way of NATO expansion was the Russian army, which still had some 500,000 soldiers deployed in the eastern region of a recently united Germany, a holdover from the Cold War. By August 1994, these soldiers had departed, knocking down the last material barrier to the expansion of the alliance. By 1997, the US and NATO were thus preparing to admit new countries into the alliance. Preliminary questions concerned which nations were to be admitted in the first round of invitations, and how to pacify a skeptical Russian Federation. To soothe Russian pride, Clinton invited Russian President Boris Yeltsin to join the G7, essentially an economic forum. Clinton elaborated, quote, "As we push old Boris to do the right but hard thing on NATO, I want him to feel the warm, beckoning glow of doors that are opening to other institutions where he's welcome." Some consideration was also made towards giving Russia a place in European security discussions. While Western leaders did not give serious consideration to the possibility of Russia itself joining NATO, they did negotiate the formation of a new forum for NATO and Russia to coordinate on security issues, creating the NATO-Russia Permanent Joint Council. NATO expansion proper began in phases. Phase 1 occurred in 1999 and brought Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary into the alliance. Phase 2 occurred in 2004 and brought in a litany of countries: Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Phase 3 began in 2008 and was supposed to have included Georgia and Ukraine. intra-NATO disagreement complicated this round of expansions. France and Germany disagreed with U.S. proposals for NATO expansion into these two countries, unwilling to antagonize Russia. By way of compromise, NATO ultimately announced that while neither country would gain immediate membership, the alliance endorsed the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine to join. Their declaration stated unequivocally, these countries will become members of NATO. Section 2. Missile Defense. In addition to the expansion of NATO military ties and EU economic ties, we should also mention something specifically tied to the United States, rather than the broader West. Missile defense installations. In 1972, the US and USSR signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, or ABM, which severely limited the implementation, and therefore development, of missile defense technologies. Advocates viewed the treaty as a way to slow the nuclear arms race by curtailing the development of anti-missile defenses that would inevitably force the other side to develop ever more powerful and inventive offensive countermeasures. This treaty made sense at the time because the threat of ballistic missile attack came primarily from state actors like the Soviet Union or the United States. The end of the Cold War renewed U.S. concerns over nuclear proliferation, especially with regard to North Korea and Iran, and especially in the context of India and Pakistan getting their own nuclear arms. The Clinton administration responded to this perceived threat by first raising the possibility of amending the ABM, so that the U.S. could begin developing defenses against those rogue nations should their weapons programs ever come to fruition. Missile defense had been a high priority of Bush's 2000 presidential campaign, and before 9/11, it took up, from the perspective of posterity, a surprising amount of presidential energy. In his first tour of Europe in 2001, President Bush signaled early that he wanted to shake up the status quo and dissolve the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. In late 2002, after 9/11 and the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, Bush abrogated the treaty. Let's listen to Bush's speech for a moment, because I think the language that he chooses, or maybe that was chosen by his speechwriters, echoes the kind of language that the Obama administration would use when talking about Russia as well. That continuity is very striking to me, because in both cases, spoiler alert, their administrations would end with extremely high tensions with the Russian Federation. Nevertheless, at the beginning of each administration, both for Bush and for Obama, there was a lot of hope that things were going to go differently.
I've just concluded a meeting of my National Security Council. We reviewed what I discussed with my friend President Vladimir Putin over the course of many meetings, many months, and that is the need for America to move beyond the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. I have concluded the ABM Treaty hinders our government's ability to develop ways to protect our people from future terrorists or rogue state missile attacks. The 1972 ABM Treaty was signed by the United States and the Soviet Union at a much different time in a vastly different world. One of the signatories, the Soviet Union, no longer exists. And neither does the hostility that once led both our countries to keep thousands of nuclear weapons on hair-trigger alert pointed at each other. Today, as the events of September the 11th made all too clear, the greatest threats to both our countries come not from each other or other big powers in the world, but from terrorists who strike without warning or rogue states who seek weapons of mass destruction. And we must have the freedom and the flexibility to develop effective defenses against those attacks. At the same time, the United States and Russia have developed a new, much more hopeful and constructive relationship. We're moving to replace mutually assured destruction with mutual cooperation. President Putin and I developed common ground for a new strategic relationship. Russia is in the midst of a transition to free markets and democracy. We are committed to forging strong economic ties between Russia and the United States and new bonds between Russia and our partners in NATO. NATO has made clear its desire to identify and pursue opportunities for joint action. We're already working closely together as the world rallies in the war against terrorism. I appreciate so much President Putin's important advice and cooperation. President Putin and I have also agreed that my decision to withdraw from the treaty will not in any way undermine our new relationship or Russian security. As President Putin said in Crawford, we are on the path to a fundamentally different relationship.
This was the sixth proposed or existing international agreement the Bush administration had rejected. Now, that a U.S. administration ignored or discarded international treaties is nothing new. This was a staple of U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War, and going as far back as the first treaty the United States government signed with an Indian nation. But the perception among many countries, even U.S. allies, was that Bush II acted in an unusually unilateral way. The eagerness of the U.S. to act, with or without sanction or support, soon took ominous form in the Bush doctrine of preventative war, first in Iraq, but the planners hoped other countries as well. Now, removing the U.S. from the ABM liberated U.S. defense contractors, allowing them to develop new missile defense systems. And although Russia and the U.S. subsequently signed the Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty in Moscow on the 24th of May 2002, which mandated cuts in deployed strategic nuclear warheads, stockpiles of these weapons were not affected, and no enforcement mechanism was included. And this allowed Putin's Russia to begin modernizing its nuclear arsenal in the face of expected U.S. technological advances. In February 2007, the United States started formal negotiations with Poland and the Czech Republic concerning construction of missile shield installations in those countries for a, quote, ground-based mid-course defense system. Now, this is where the problems really come, because not only are we abrogating existing treaties with what had been the Soviet Union and what continued to be Russia, but we're starting to put these advanced weapons systems and new developments into countries that are not only in the former Soviet sphere of influence, but pretty close to Russia itself. On August 14th, 2008, shortly after the 2008 South Ossetia War, more on that in a moment, the US and Poland announced a deal to implement the missile defense system on Polish territory, with a tracking system placed in the Czech Republic, and an agreement was signed with Poland in August 2008. Section 3. Russia responds. Russian intellectuals have long cultivated a sense of exceptionalism. Like the Puritan notion of America as a city on a hill, the Jeffersonian notion of the United States as an empire of liberty, or the contemporary evangelical idea of America as a nation with a special place in God's plan, similar notions of grandeur resound throughout Russian culture. Of most especial consideration for our purposes are three ideas. 1. Russia needs to be constantly on guard against attack by foreigners. Consider the precedents set by the Mongols, Napoleon, the Kaiser, or Hitler. 2. Moscow, as the Third Rome, the successor of the First Rome that was conquered by barbarians, and the Second Rome, Constantinople, conquered by Muslims, Moscow is the defender of the true faith, Orthodox Christianity. 3. Russia has a long tradition, following Christ's admonition in John 15:13, of helping its friends, its political neighbors. Recall Russia's defense of Serbia during World War I. In addition to these long-term antecedents are two primary facts about the politics of the Russian Federation. 1. Russian elites did not consider their nation a defeated power after the Cold War, akin to Japan or Germany after World War II. And number two, therefore, their foreign policy constantly strives towards recognition as a great power, a partner in global affairs, not some second-tier, backwater, regional force that can be pushed around by a superpower. This sense of Russian exceptionalism and the continued sense among Russia's political class that the Russian Federation was still a geopolitical force to be reckoned with did not jive well with the 1990s, where Russia seemed to face humiliation on every front. Its economy shrank by an average of 6% from 1990 to 1998, made all the worse by Western-imposed economic shock therapy that privatized much of the Russian economy without commensurate material benefits for the majority of its citizens. The new federation suffered military defeat on its own turf during the First Chechnya War of 94 to 96. It watched with growing anxiety as NATO expanded and as the EU took concrete shape. Meanwhile, traditional signs of Soviet grandeur, veto power in the UN Security Council, nuclear parity with the United States, seem to yield few dividends these days. NATO and the US simply bypassed the UN when they wanted to, as in Serbia 1999 and Iraq 2003. Russia was also given conditions for joining major international organizations like the World Trade Organization, or WTO, that Russian patriots found condescending and humiliating. By the turn of the millennium, optimistic Russian expectations of integration with the West were thus replaced with widespread disillusionment with Russia's phony partnership with the West. What might be characterized as a national humiliation complex, stemming from the perception that Russia was being treated as a defeated country rather than as a valuable ally, began to grip Russia's political class. Upon ascending to the presidency, Putin's primary foreign policy goal, therefore, was to restore Russia's autonomy and its great power status. In the wake of the identity crisis produced by the breakup of the USSR, Putin pushed a new meta-narrative that combined Tsarist and Soviet symbols. The double-headed eagle of the Romanovs became the new national symbol, the Soviet national anthem was reinstated, albeit with updated lyrics. His administration also renewed support for the Russian Orthodox Church, rekindling the idea of Russia as the defender of the true faith. Cognizant of his country's continued economic weakness, Putin nevertheless looked for ways to achieve prestige and status. He came quickly to the aid of the U.S. in the wake of 9/11, assuring the Bush II administration that his country, with its long history in Central Asia and decades of experience fighting Islamic terrorism, would cooperate fully in anti-terrorist measures. And this initial cooperation was extensive. Intelligence sharing, allowing U.S. planes to fly over Russian airspace, acquiescing to U.S. bases in Central Asia, participating in search and rescue missions, assisting the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan against the Taliban. Putin also made several early attempts to shore up relations with the United States. He pulled Russian forces from a surveillance base in Cuba and a naval installation in Vietnam. His reaction to Bush pulling out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty was relatively mild considering the stakes involved. He made little ruckus when the Baltic states joined NATO in 2004. He accepted the creation of the NATO-Russia Council as a vehicle for future cooperation, and he agreed to strategic arms reduction. From Putin's perspective, these gestures and cooperations were meant to help create a new security structure akin to the Concert of Europe that had guided great power diplomacy for much of the 19th century. Before the November 2001 U.S.-Russia summit, for instance, Putin privately compared his partnership with Bush in the anti-terrorist coalition to that between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill in the anti-Nazi coalition during World War II. This U.S.-Russia partnership hit its apex in 2002, after which it became increasingly clear that Bush II regarded Russia as, at best, a useful regional partner, not an international equal. In 2003, for instance, the U.S. did not even bother to consult Russia before it invaded Iraq, a former Soviet ally. More alarmingly still, from the Russian perspective, was U.S. support for the revolutions in Georgia, 2003, Ukraine, 2004, and Kyrgyzstan, 2005, regime changes that were perceived by Russian elites as humiliating interferences in Russia's sphere of influence, perhaps even a model for destabilizing Russia itself. The Ukrainian Orange Revolution in particular was a shock, as it rejected a presidential candidate that Putin had personally and publicly favored. It now seemed to Russia's leadership, and Putin most especially, that the U.S. not only demeaned their nation's status as a great global power, but was interfering in their near abroad with increasing heedlessness. Thus, the second half of the decade saw a resurgence of Russian independence. This was prompted by the perceived failure of their diplomatic overtures towards the West and the insults and humiliations Russia was said to have endured, but it was made possible by a change in the nation's economic situation. Not only was the confidence of Russia's leadership buoyed by the fact that it paid off its international debt in 2006, restoring both its sovereignty and solvency, but the price of oil increased dramatically from $35 per barrel in 2004 to $147 per barrel in 2008. Since energy exports made up a significant portion of government revenue and economic life, this was a trend of singular importance. Sergei Ivanov, at this time Russia's Minister of Defense, summed up the mindset of Russia's leadership in the summer of 2006, quote, "Russia has now completely recovered the status of great power that bears global responsibility for the situation on the planet and the future of human civilization." Economic confidence brought back a rejuvenated sense of national pride, stoked by Putin's brand of Russian exceptionalism. Russians planted the Russian tricolor flag on the Arctic seabed in early August 2007, and resumed long-range strategic bomber flights weeks later. In 2008, Putin renewed annual military parades through Red Square and tested new ballistic missile designs. By August 2009, a pair of Russian nuclear attack submarines were stationed off the U.S. coast. Most critically, Putin took a hard line to the prospect of Georgian and Ukrainian integration into NATO. By August 2008, with NATO's declaration ringing in his ears, Georgian President Saakashvili assumed he had a tacit guarantee of Western support, and thus began to resist Russian political pressure. Putin responded to this stiffened will by invading Georgia in 2008, beginning the Ossetian War. This war went badly for Georgia and ended quickly, but not before Russia had been roundly condemned for its behavior. And despite the economic costs, Putin's government did not restore the status quo ante or apologize for its actions. Rather than flinching, it would seem that Russia's leadership viewed the situation as a decisive opportunity to just say no to Western encroachment. Putin's government also took a harder line against U.S. missile defense policy. Now recall, after the ABM treaty had been abrogated, the Russians didn't make any immediate noise. But by the late 2000s, they had decided it was time to respond. In August 2007, when the United States announced plans to deploy 10 interceptor missiles in Poland and a radar system in the Czech Republic, Russia threatened to place short-range nuclear missiles on its borders with NATO if those installations were completed. That same year, Putin mentioned that Russia was developing, quote, strategic weapon systems of a completely different type that will fly at hypersonic speed and will be able to change trajectory both in terms of altitude and direction. This should have been a clear indication that while Russia as yet could not stop the tide of what its elites saw as Western expansion, it was ready and willing to engage in a renewed arms race in order to counter the new threat. This pattern did not end when Putin temporarily stepped down from the presidency. On November 5, 2008, his successor, Medvedev, reiterated the official Russian position to U.S. missile defense efforts, quote, "The creation of a missile defense system, the encirclement of Russia with military bases, the relentless expansion of NATO. We have gotten the clear impression that they are testing our strength." The combination of Russia's perceived post-Soviet humiliations and Russia's resurgent resistance to US-EU policies meant that tensions at the end of Bush's administration were at their fraughest in years. Like Afghanistan and the financial sector, this was a low point out of which the Obama administration would attempt to ascend. In this video, we covered the aftermath of the USSR's collapse, including the expansion of NATO and the development of missile defense by the United States. We also covered Russia's attempts to grapple with and counteract these developments. The next video will focus on the first term of Obama's presidency and his administration's attempts at renewed bilateral cooperation with the Russian Federation. Thanks so much for watching the video. If you're interested in other aspects of the Obama administration or American history in general, I'd highly recommend my book, He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years. It covers 6 key topics: the War on Terror, including what happened in Africa, the financial crisis, healthcare reform, marginal struggles, including Black Lives Matter, trans rights, and gay liberation, the climate crisis, and the pipeline battles that came to dominate the Obama administration's interactions with indigenous people. You can pick it up today at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, IndieBound. Otherwise, you can check out the sources in the description for other recommendations for further reading, and I'll see you next time.